Atlantis is a fictional island mentioned in an allegory on the hubris of nations in Plato's works Timaeus and Critias, wherein it represents the antagonist naval power that besieges ancient Athens, the pseudo-historic embodiment of Plato's ideal state in the Republic. In the story, Athens repels the Atlantean attack unlike any other nation of the known world, supposedly bearing witness to the superiority of Plato's concept of a state. The story concludes with Atlantis falling out of favor with the deities and submerging into the Atlantic Ocean. Despite its minor importance in Plato's work, the Atlantis story has had a considerable impact on literature. The allegorical aspect of Atlantis was taken up in utopian works of several Renaissance writers, such as Francis Bacon's New Atlantis and Thomas More's Utopia. On the other hand, 19th-century amateur scholars misinterpreted Plato's narrative as historical tradition, most famously Ignatius L. Donnelly in his Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Plato's vague indications of the time of the events, more than 9,000 years before his time, and the alleged location of Atlantis, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, gave rise to much pseudo-scientific speculation. As a consequence, Atlantis has become a byword for any and all supposed advanced prehistoric lost civilizations and continues to inspire contemporary fiction, from comic books to films. While present-day philologists and classicists agree on the story's fictional character, there is still debate on what served as its inspiration. Plato is known to have freely borrowed some of his allegories and metaphors from older traditions, as he did, for instance, with the story of Gyges. This led a number of scholars to investigate possible inspiration of Atlantis from Egyptian records of the Thero eruption, the Sea People's invasion, or the Trojan War. Others have rejected this chain of tradition as implausible and insist that Plato created an entirely fictional account, drawing loose inspiration from contemporary events such as the failed Athenian invasion of Sicily in 415 to 413 BC or the destruction of Helike in 373 BC. Aside from Plato's original account, modern interpretations regarding Atlantis are an amalgamation of diverse, speculative movements that began in the 16th century, when scholars began to identify Atlantis with the New World. Francisco López de Gomara was the first to state that Plato was referring to America, as did Francis Bacon and Alexander von Humboldt. Janus Johannes Burchard said in 1663 Orbi novo non novo, the New World is not new. Athanasius Kircher accepted Plato's account as literally true, describing Atlantis as a small continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Contemporary perceptions of Atlantis share roots with Mayanism, which can be traced to the beginning of the modern age, when European imaginations were fueled by their initial encounters with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. From this era sprang apocalyptic and utopian visions that would inspire many subsequent generations of theorists. Most of these interpretations are considered pseudo-history, pseudoscience, or pseudo-archaeology, as they have presented their works as academic or scientific, but lack the standards or criteria. The Flemish cartographer and geographer Abraham Ortelius is believed to have been the first person to imagine that the continents were joined before drifting to their present positions. In the 1596 edition of his Thesaurus Geographicus he wrote, "Unless it be a fable, the island of Gadir or Gades, Cadiz, will be the remaining part of the island of Atlantis or America, which was not sunk, as Plato reports in the Timaeus, so much as torn away from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and flood. The traces of the ruptures are shown by the projections of Europe and Africa and the indentations of America in the parts of the coasts of these three said lands that face each other to anyone who, using a map of the world, carefully considered them. So that anyone may say with Strabo in Book 2, that what Plato says of the island of Atlantis on the authority of Solon is not a figment." The term Utopia, from no place, was coined by Sir Thomas More in his 16th-century work of fiction Utopia. Inspired by Plato's Atlantis and travelers' accounts of the Americas, More described an imaginary land set in the New World. His idealistic vision established a connection between the Americas and utopian societies, a theme that Bacon discussed in the New Atlantis, 1623. A character in the narrative gives a history of Atlantis that is similar to Plato's and places Atlantis in America. People had begun believing that the Mayan and Aztec ruins could possibly be the remnants of Atlantis. Much speculation began as to the origins of the Maya, which led to a variety of narratives and publications that tried to rationalize the discoveries within the context of the Bible and that had undertones of racism in their connections between the Old and New World. The Europeans believed the indigenous people to be inferior and incapable of building that which was now in ruins, and by sharing a common history, they insinuate that another race must have been responsible. In the middle and late 19th century, several renowned Mesoamerican scholars, starting with Charles E. Scheinbrasser, and including Edward Herbert Thompson and Augustus Le Plongeon, formally proposed that Atlantis was somehow related to Mayan and Aztec culture. The French scholar Brasser traveled extensively through Mesoamerica in the mid-1800s, and was renowned for his translations of Mayan texts, most notably the sacred book Popol Vuh, as well as a comprehensive history of the region. Soon after these publications, however, Brasser lost his academic credibility, due to his claim that the Maya peoples had descended from the Toltecs, people he believed were the surviving population of the racially superior civilization of Atlantis. His work, combined with the skillful, romantic illustrations of Zon Frederick Waldeck, which visually alluded to Egypt and other aspects of the Old World, created an authoritative fantasy that excited much interest in the connections between worlds. Inspired by Brasser-Dubberg's diffusion theories, the pseudo-archaeologist Augustus Le Plongeon traveled to Mesoamerica and performed some of the first excavations of many famous Mayan ruins. Le Plongeon invented narratives, such as the Kingdom of Mu saga, which romantically drew connections to him, his wife Alice, and Egyptian deities Osiris and Isis, as well as to Heinrich Schliemann, who had just discovered the ancient city of Troy from Homer's epic poetry, that had been described as merely mythical. He also believed that he had found connections between the Greek and the Mayan languages, which produced a narrative of the destruction of Atlantis. The 1882 publication of Atlantis, The Antediluvian World by Ignatius L. Donnelly, stimulated much popular interest in Atlantis. He was greatly inspired by early works in Mayanism, and like them, attempted to establish that all known ancient civilizations were descended from Atlantis, which he saw as a technologically sophisticated, more advanced culture. Donnelly drew parallels between creation stories in the Old and New Worlds, attributing the connections to Atlantis, where he believed the biblical Garden of Eden existed. As implied by the title of his book, he also believed that Atlantis was destroyed by the Great Flood mentioned in the Bible. Donnelly is credited as the father of the 19th-century Atlantis revival and is the reason the myth endures today. He unintentionally promoted an alternative method of inquiry to history and science, and the idea that myths contain hidden information that opens them to ingenious interpretation by people who believe they have new or special insight. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophists, took up Donnelly's interpretations when she wrote The Secret Doctrine, 1888, which she claimed was originally dictated in Atlantis. She maintained that the Atlanteans were cultural heroes, contrary to Plato, who describes them mainly as a military threat. She believed in a form of racial evolution, as opposed to primate evolution. In her process of evolution, the Atlanteans were the fourth root race, which was succeeded by the fifth, the Aryan race, which she identified with the modern human race. In her book, Blavatsky reported that the civilization of Atlantis reached its peak between 1,000,000 and 900,000 years ago, but destroyed itself through internal warfare brought about by the dangerous use of psychic and supernatural powers of the inhabitants. Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy and Waldorf schools, along with other well-known theosophists, such as Annie Besant, also wrote of cultural evolution in much the same vein. Other occultists followed the same lead, at least to the point of tracing the lineage of occult practices back to Atlantis. Among the most famous is Dion Fortune in her esoteric orders and their work. Drawing on the ideas of Rudolf Steiner and Hans Horbiger, Egon Friedel started his book Kulturgeschichte des Altertums, and thus his historical analysis of antiquity, with the ancient culture of Atlantis. The book was published in 1940. Blavatsky was also inspired by the work of the 18th-century astronomers on Sylvan Bailey, who had orientalized the Atlantis myth in his mythical continent of Hyperborea, a reference to Greek myths featuring a northern European region of the same name, home to a giant, godlike race. Dan Edelstein claims that her reshaping of this theory in The Secret Doctrine provided the Nazis with a mythological precedent and a pretext for their ideological platform and their subsequent genocide. However, Blavatsky's writings mention that the Atlantean were in fact olive-skinned peoples with mongoloid traits who were the ancestors of modern Native Americans, Mongolians, and Malayans. The idea that the Atlanteans were Hyperborean, Nordic supermen who originated in the northern Atlantic or even in the far north, was popular in the German Ariosophic movement around 1900, propagated by Guido von List and others. It gave its name to the Thulager Gesellschaft, an anti-Semite Munich lodge, which preceded the German Nazi Party. The scholars Karl Georg Schätzsch, 1920, and Hermann Wirth, 1928, were the first to speak of a Nordic Atlantean or Aryan Nordic master race that spread from Atlantis over the northern hemisphere and beyond. The Hyperboreans were contrasted with the Jewish people. Party ideologist Alfred Rosenberg, in The Myth of the 20th Century, 1930, and SS leader Heinrich Himmler made it part of the official doctrine. The idea was followed up by the adherents of esoteric Nazism such as Julius Evola, 1934. And, more recently, Miguel Serrano, 1978. The idea of Atlantis as the homeland of the Caucasian race would contradict the beliefs of older esoteric and theosophic groups, which taught that the Atlanteans were non-Caucasian brown-skinned peoples. Modern esoteric groups, including the Theosophic Society, do not consider Atlantean society to have been superior or utopian, they rather consider it a lower stage of evolution. The clairvoyant Edgar Cayce spoke frequently of Atlantis. During his life readings, he claimed that many of his subjects were reincarnations of people who had lived there. By tapping into their collective consciousness, the Akashic records, a term borrowed from theosophy, Cayce declared that he was able to give detailed descriptions of the lost continent. He also asserted that Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s, sparking much popularity of the myth in that decade, and that there is a hall of records beneath the Egyptian Sphinx which holds the historical texts of Atlantis. As continental drift became widely accepted during the 1960s, and the increased understanding of plate tectonics demonstrated the impossibility of a lost continent in the geologically recent past, most lost continent theories of Atlantis began to wane in popularity. Plato scholar Julianus, Regents Professor of Philosophy at the University of Arizona, had this to say on the matter: the continuing industry of discovering Atlantis illustrates the dangers of reading Plato. For he is clearly using what has become a standard device of fiction, stressing the historicity of an event, and the discovery of hitherto unknown authorities, as an indication that what follows is fiction. The idea is that we should use the story to examine our ideas of government and power. We have missed the point if instead of thinking about these issues we go off exploring the seabed. The continuing misunderstanding of Plato as historian here enables us to see why his distrust of imaginative writing is sometimes justified. One of the proposed explanations for the historical context of the Atlantis story is that it serves as Plato's warning to his fellow citizens against their striving for naval power. Kenneth Feder points out that Critias' story in the Timaeus provides a major clue. In the dialogue, Critias says, referring to Socrates' hypothetical society, "And when you were speaking yesterday about your city and citizens, the tale which I have just been repeating to you came into my mind, and I remarked with astonishment how, by some mysterious coincidence, you agreed in almost every particular with the narrative of Solon." Feder quotes A. E. Taylor, who wrote, "We could not be told much more plainly that the whole narrative of Solon's conversation with the priests and his intention of writing the poem about Atlantis are an invention of Plato's fancy."